All right, guys, we got Adam Hammond on the line. Adam, how you doing?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Doing well. Hey, I've been looking forward to this conversation because, it's something that interests me. I've kind of, I want to try a bear hunt. Don't know much of anything about it at this point, but I know, it's always good to have somebody on a topic like this that I'm not familiar with. It's real easy to come up with the questions that way because I'm just, trying to get information for myself. So I've been looking forward to this, and I know, the listeners are going to learn a lot as well. But before we start, dive into all things bear here in Georgia, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up as Georgia's bear biologist.
Sure. No, I appreciate you having me on. I came to work actually about 21 years ago now. So I did grow up in the North Georgia area, and I kind of grew up playing in the mountains. But really, I'm from Calhoun, Gordon County, and now I'm back in Armurchie. So I'm pretty much back home as far as where I grew up and where I'm at now. But as far as my career goes, I spent the first few years down in southwest Georgia working with the Bob White Quail Initiative. I was actually a quail biologist before I became a regional biologist in the northwest Georgia region. And then ultimately, after working with bears for quite a number of years, among other things, then I was eventually given the opportunity to be the first state, bear biologist for the, full-time kind of situation. So it's been good. The last 3 years, I've been doing it full time. We've been able to do some research, and that's been educational and good. And hopefully we get to talk a little bit about some of the research we've been doing.
Yeah, yep, absolutely. Now, did you have, before you ever came on with the DNR, did you have an interest in bears? Did you ever bear hunt or anything like that? Or was that kind of all new to you?
I would say I was always interested in bears, but as far as being, super into bear hunting or anything like that, I wouldn't say that. I certainly went to the mountains a few times and went sitting and trying to kill a deer. And while I was there, I'd have been tickled to kill a bear, but but nowadays, I deal with bears all the time. And so, we see a lot of bears and handle a lot of bears, and I get my bear fix pretty good with the job, but it's a great situation, and I'm happy to do it. And of course, we've got, healthy bear population, especially in the mountains. Certainly have a lot of bears in southeast Georgia, down in the swamp, the Okefenokee Swamp area, and a few bears down there where you used to work in central Georgia. So
yeah,
that one's a little different and a little more sensitive, I'd say, compared to what we've got in these other areas. But yeah, and a lot of times you'll catch me, I'll get into talking about bears and I'll be talking strictly about the mountains. So if you have an interest in something else, you have to pull the reins back a little bit and say, hey, I'm talking about another area. But
yeah, well, even as I was kind of coming up with these questions, I had to watch myself doing the same thing when most of my questions are kind of focused on that North Georgia population, but I certainly do want to dive into, that central and southern population as well as we get into that. But yeah, actually my first bear I ever saw in the wild was there on Okie Woods doing a prescribed fire. It come barreling across one of the fire breaks as we were heading down it on an ATV. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah. What years? Well, I probably shouldn't ask you that, but I was curious. When were you down there working?
I came on in late 2011 and left in 2015, I guess. So
okay, very good.
Yeah. Now, before we kind of get into the current state of Georgia bears and maybe some of those different populations, can you give us a little historical perspective about Georgia's bear population? I mean, have we always had bears here? Did they move in from the mountains up north, or I mean, where did our bear population come from, I guess?
Yeah, no, we've always had bears in the state as long as, recorded history goes back. And, basically during that time, of course, we had bears all over the Appalachians, and even central and south Georgia, the populations were likely even larger than they are today. So, over time, things have changed. And there was a time when bears were persecuted pretty good in the mountains. They weren't given a lot of protection. And so basically the population had dwindled. And, this is probably 40s, 50s. There was a lot of things going on, but ultimately the population was given some protection as a game species, I think in the 70s. And then over time, we've seen that population in the mountains grow. It was growing pretty steadily, I would say, up until about 2009, 2010, 11, somewhere in that range. And then it seems that we've, actually seen a little bit of leveling off in the population since that time. You wouldn't know that if you talk to people, because obviously we've got, plenty of bears in the mountains, and they still get into trouble sometimes. So we hear about complaints, and of course people are dealing with, nuisance bear issues from time to time, which almost always, go back to people issues. And so anyway, that population is very healthy and strong, but it has the growth has leveled off a little bit in recent years. We say we have about 3,000 bears in the mountains, and we recently did some work through the University of Tennessee and Joe Clark. And basically he did some hair snares and was able to use that as sort of a DNA mark recapture study. And the population was estimated to be right around 3,000 bears. So anyway, we also have about 300, 350, we say, in central Georgia. It's a very isolated, small population there. It's restricted to the Ocmulgee River Basin there that you were referring to earlier. When you get down the Okefenokee, we don't have great numbers on that population. We say it's about 800 bears. I feel like it's probably a little higher than that. It's just been some time since we've actually been able to collect any data down there. So that one's part of the Florida bear population too, so it crosses over the state lines. Of course, keep that in mind anytime we're talking about either Appalachian bears or southeast Georgia with Okefenokee. Those bear populations don't know state boundaries. And so, the Appalachians, we've got, bears crossing over into Tennessee, North Carolina, and South Carolina, and also in North Georgia. So all part of the greater Southern Appalachian bear population, which is doing really well.
Yeah. Now, how did we end up, I guess, with three distinct populations? Were they once all across the state and they've just gotten kind of segmented from growth, population growth, human population growth, or have they always been distinct?
No, I think they at one time would have been, all over the state and one, more or less continuous population. Now, obviously, did you have bears going from South Georgia to North Georgia and things like that all that often? Probably not, but, somewhat of a connected area, and there wasn't any major barriers at the time, to keep them from being able to do that. Today, it's quite a bit different. And when we think about central Georgia, especially, that population is a very small population. It's very genetically isolated. We actually did some work through the University of Georgia a few years ago, and genetically, our North Georgia bears and our South Georgia bears are more similar than central Georgia is to either of the two populations. So that central Georgia population has kind of begun to show some issues, with genetics and inbreeding and things like that. So we're going to have to, potentially do something about that over time. But in the meantime, we're just being very cautious with it and managing it, conservatively to just make sure we don't, make mistakes that can't be reversed anytime soon. So, but yeah, there would have been one population across the state, and over time with development and things like, people moving in, as well as, like I said earlier, there's a lot of, today, if you think about bears, there's all kinds of opinions about bears, right? Some people love bears, love them to sort of an unhealthy level, and they don't want them killed for any reason. They want to feed them, they want to treat them like a teddy bear. Obviously, that's not great. On the other hand, you got some people that hate bears and they just want to kill every bear that's in the woods, and then you got hunters and folks in the middle that, they're happy to have bears around, of course, want to manage them and maintain a healthy population, but it's not something, there just seems to be a lot of extremes when it comes to bears, unlike a lot of other animals.
Right. Yeah. Now, what is it, I guess, I mean, I know it's human populations come in and kind of segmented these, but why don't you see bear populations, I guess, kind of in those middle grounds? I mean, what do they need habitat wise that they're not getting, I guess, between those populations?
Well, first off, I'd say, it wouldn't be uncommon to see a bear anywhere in the state today. There are times when we have bears that you hear about on the news that have gone to Atlanta. We've had bears at the airport, bears in MARTA stations. Anywhere in the state of Georgia, you could see a bear, and it wouldn't really be all that surprising. So bears range wide, and they can cover a lot of ground, and obviously sometimes they do. Why they're not established in certain areas, that's a valid question, and I don't know that I have all the answers there, but I think largely it's about when we see bears kind of expand into new areas, for example, coming out of North Georgia, and we saw this maybe back in 2013 when we had a terrible acorn year. That fall, bears kind of shifted south, and I believe we saw range expansion in one season. It was like bears were just moving, sows and cubs. Everything was moving south, trying to find some food. Those same bears, spent the winter there and then woke up there in the spring. And all that to say that during that time, there were tons of bears being road killed, hit on the road by vehicles. So I don't know, it's a lot, bears start crossing roads and encountering vehicles. That's one way they die. They get into trouble, and sometimes they're killed illegally for that. Of course, ultimately, they're going to try to land somewhere. They don't want to just be out there by themselves. They're looking for an established population, and they'll use those river corridors largely to move around, but, they can be seen just about anywhere.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier the populations pretty much, or it seems to be stabilized or stabilizing. Is that all three? Are they all three kind of in the same situation, or was that mainly the North Georgia one you were referring to?
Yeah, I'm kind of referring to North Georgia when I say it's kind of leveled off a little bit. It doesn't mean we couldn't see some increases, and we may have in recent years. We'll probably be talking about oak acorns, and you'll hear me call them acorns, so hopefully you know what I'm talking about when I say acorns. But anyway, when you start looking at the acorn crop over time, this will be, it's hard to say exactly what the crop looks like this year, but this could be the third pretty good year of oak mast in the mountains, and 3 good years in a row means 3 good years of reproduction, 3 good years of cub survival, and usually when we have a lot of acorns, we don't have a great bear harvest in the mountains. So, the last couple of years have been okay, but they've not been, record years. So you start combining all those factors, and the population could be growing again. When you look to Central Georgia, that population's been studied some. We're still trying to learn more about it, even now. But it seems to be, holding its own, but it's not growing really. It doesn't seem to be increasing very much at all, and certainly not expanding out beyond the range in that area very well. And when you get to southeast Georgia, bears are still very much tied to the swamp. But, we are starting to get reports here and there of, bears bouncing around on the perimeter of the swamp and even venturing out a little bit into areas where we don't typically hear from them much. Are we getting a lot of bears in those areas? It's hard to say. How has the population changed? Again, we haven't studied that population much over time. It's been 20 plus years since it was studied. So we don't know as much about it, but we know we've got a healthy population. We've seen the harvest kind of steadily trend up in southeast Georgia. Some of that's due to increased opportunity, but some of it's just due to increases in the population too. So I think it's probably trending up, but exactly how much and all that, we're not completely sure.
You mentioned something there about when we have a really good acorn mast, especially in the mountain area, that the harvest kind of seems to be less than other years. And I'm curious, is that because it's a more widespread, feeding range where they're not all concentrated in a select group of oaks, or what's the reason for that? Okay. That's what I kind of figured.
Exactly it. So when, and even, I'm a little puzzled about this year's acorn crop, to be quite honest with you. A lot of times when we have, basically when an acorn crop in the fall is kind of light, so we don't have very many acorns, bears are going to find them. They're going to go to the acorns and they're going to find them. Usually we have some somewhere, so it's not that they're not there. It's just a matter of, they may have to travel a little farther to find them. They may be scarce. And so, if you think about how bears live and survive, they're going to go forage on acorns pretty hot and heavy now from now until the time they enter the den. Most of our females will den, especially those that are going to give birth and those with young cubs. They're going to be most likely to spend time in a den, significant amount of time in the winter. But even our males, a pretty high percentage of males will also take some time off during the winter, and they can do that because they packed on the fat, and their bodies are designed to handle that. So they'll actually be just gorging themselves on acorns from now until the time they enter the den. When you have, not as many acorns, you tend to hear reports from hunters about just concentrations of bears, and tons of bear signs, especially early season like this, when bears are still climbing. You'll have broken branches and you'll have bear scat everywhere, and you'll have acorns. It'll be restricted. Maybe the acorn crop's restricted, but you get a really concentrated situation where bears are flooding into these few select locations where they can find food. And of course, hunters take advantage of that. They communicate. And it's easy to find signs. So it's maybe not easy, but anyway, it's just, you can find the bears, and if you can find them, then there's a increased chance that you'll harvest a bear. So in these years, not to mention that in these light years, when acorn crops are light, bears are moving around to try to find something, so they're on the move. That puts them, exposed a little more. And so harvest tends to peak in those years. And we can look back over time at our mass survey data and look at our harvest data, and you can kind of see those peaks a lot of times. On the other hand, when you have widespread acorn availability all over the mountains, then bears don't have to move as much, and so they're a little less susceptible to hunting pressure and road kills, which also peak, by the way, in a bad acorn year. You typically have more road kills, complaints from the public about nuisance bear behavior, whereas it usually ends by August, early September. In a bad acorn year, we'll have complaints that'll be trickling in October, November, sometimes even into December and further on. So all that to say that, yeah, acorn availability in the mountains and harvest, they're intertwined. This year's kind of starting off strong on the harvest, which would maybe lead us to believe that acorn availability is scarce, but I'm not so sure. We do an acorn survey every fall, and I think we haven't got all our data in yet, so I've not seen it completely, but it seems like we have some acorns, and maybe a little more than you would expect given the harvest, and even some complaints that are still coming in now. It just seems like that there's maybe a little different. I don't know how to phrase it, but it seems like acorn availability may vary a little bit across North Georgia this year. That's just a guess. The other thing is it could just be that this is the third year in a row when we haven't had we've had an abundance of acorns for the last two falls, and now this is the third fall where we're going to have a lot of acorns. Maybe this is just what happens when you have 3 good years in a row. I don't think we've ever had 3 good years in a row when it comes to acorn availability, in the mountains. So not in my time anyway.
And you talked about the denning there. What in Georgia, when's that kind of take place for them to go den? Because obviously, down here in the South, the mountains are a little different, but 1 week it can be 30 and then the next week it can be like 70, 75. So whereas,
Right.
the northern region of the United States, it gets cold earlier and it stays pretty cold. So when's that denning period kind of take place?
Yeah, we'll have some females that'll be entering their den, probably early November. That's usually about as early as it happens. Some will come in, mid-November, some later. Some of it may be tied to food availability, could be tied to body condition. We've had some females that didn't enter until, December. On the other hand, most of the bears, I used to say that they would generally be out by April the 1st. So most of our denning bears would be out and about by April 1st. We had a bear this past winter that stayed in the den. I want to say it was early May before she came out. And, of course, by that time it's hot,
Yeah.
But she was also the last female that we had go into a den. So, her cubs may have been a little bit further behind, and it was a tree den. So, there's some different variables at play, but yeah, it's normal for them to enter November, December. and they'll stay till April. Would be pretty common.
Okay.
Now, when I say that, that's mainly females I'm speaking of. Males are going to enter later. And some males, we had a fair number of males. When I speak about our males and females that are doing this or that, I'm talking about our collared bears. We had about 40% of our collared males last year that actually spent some significant time in a winter den. But even then, they weren't quite like the females. They weren't necessarily tied to one den site. They weren't necessarily there the whole time from November to March or April. They may spend 3 or 4 weeks or a month in one spot, and then the weather changes, and they may get up, walk around a little bit, or they may be disturbed or whatever. And they'll go find another spot, and then when it cools off, they'll crawl in another hole. So they're not as tied to a den as females, but they certainly still do spend a significant amount of time in the den, or at least some of them do.
Okay. And then you mentioned during that about the tree den. So what all do bears, use as a den? Because that kind of piqued my curiosity, because if it was wintertime and I was climbing a tree and a bear poked its head out, I'd be like, oh my gosh. So what all do they, choose to den in?
Right. Well, good news is you're probably not going to be climbing a hollow tree. Not on purpose anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But no, most of our dens that we encounter through this research, most of the dens, and even in my time in the mountains working with bears, just finding dens or being, having dens reported and things, a lot of them are ground dens. So when I say a ground den, I'm talking about a steep slope, one that you or I wouldn't really want to walk on. A lot of times the cover is very, very thick. And then also, a lot of times they'll just actually excavate a hole in the side of the den. In the side of the bank there, so steep slope, they'll dig a hole out, and then they'll be inside that ground den. That's the most common, I think, that we find. Sometimes those ground dens are up under a fallen tree. It could be in the stump of a tree, where basically a tree falls over and creates a big hole there. And they could be at the base of the tree there. They could be under the bole of the tree. So get a little bit of all that. We also had a few bears that spent time, denning in rock outcrops and rock cavities, even almost like a small cave, if you will. That was minor in terms of numbers. We only had one that was in what I would consider a rock cavity. We had one that was in a rock outcrop. Only had one in a hollow tree, and it was, just a big, I think it was a black gum, but it was just a huge black gum, and it had a hollow at the base of the tree, and it had a hollow at the top of the tree. And sort of that center part of the tree was still pretty solid, and so the bears were going up and over and sort of hanging out there in the center of the tree. So it's interesting. I've not dealt with very many tree dens over time, but historically, go back to the tri-state bear study that was Tennessee, North Carolina, and Georgia back in the 60s and 70s, that, they basically came back and said that hollow trees were the number one den site for the mountains of the Appalachians here in Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina. I think that might have changed a little bit over time, and that could be just because we don't have as many big hollow trees available. But ground dens are a pretty popular spot for them these days, it seems.
Just and we've been talking about a lot of this as we've gone along here, but looking at some basic bear biology, of course, as far as food sources, we've hit on that a good bit. It sounds like, acorns are extremely important in their diet, but what else? What other kind of things do black bears eat here in Georgia?
Bears eat kind of anything and everything they can get a hold of. They're not particular, and so even though white oaks are by far their preferred fall food, if there are no white oaks, they'll eat whatever's available in terms of acorn availability. So you've got some years when chestnut oaks or mountain oaks tend to do better, than other oaks, and so if that's what's available, they'll eat them, whether they prefer them or not. Same thing with red oaks. Some years early season they'll be hitting cherries hard. If that's what's available, they'll eat, of course, persimmons. You go down into the swamps in southeast Georgia, and black gum is a huge food for bears. Of course, in the mountains we have black gum, and I'm sure bears eat it occasionally, but just how much, I don't know. We of course have beech trees and beech nuts, and bears will take advantage of those too. So bears aren't really super particular. They obviously have their preferences, but they'll eat whatever's available when they can find it. Throughout the year, they're going to eat soft mast as it's available, those things too. But of course, now it's time to pack on the pounds for the denning season. So that's what they're doing, trying to find these high-fat foods like acorns.
What about I guess when they're most active? Are they similar to deer in that they're most active at dawn and dusk, or are they pretty active throughout the day, or how do they behave in that manner?
It's interesting. We've been doing quite a bit of bear trapping in this research study, and we've had cameras out, and we haven't really dug into the actual data. But obviously, bears are, I would say, yes, they're most active early and most active in that, late evening before dark. And, historically, I've heard, and you sort of hear people talk about bears being nocturnal, spending a lot of time moving around at night. Not really seen a ton of that, or, we haven't totally studied all the GPS data that we have or anything. But yeah, when we see bears moving around on camera, it's generally it's early and late. Now, they will move in the middle of the day. And certainly if a bear is used to people, or we get nuisance bears or habituated bears, or bears that are somewhat food conditioned to human provided foods, those kind of bears, all bets are off. They move around whenever they want to go get something to eat. Sometimes they modify their schedule to match up with people's schedule. But generally speaking, I think, early to mid morning is pretty common. And then, just before dark is also very common.
What about home range size? What kind of territory, I guess, does a typical bear cover?
Yeah, that's a good question too. And it's interesting, generally females, their home ranges, not surprisingly, are a lot smaller than males. I've seen bears that, camped out on, food sources, and you guys may have seen that too in your hunting efforts. But, it's not uncommon for a bear to shrink its home range when there's, tons of food available. And sometimes I think we miss that too with feeders and, in the mountains where we've got a lot of houses and people, and, somebody may have a bird feeder out, or they may be feeding the deer and the turkeys and everything else in the woods, and when that happens, they'll draw bears from all around, into that area. And so you can have an unusually high density of bears around these non-natural food sources. That's not terribly uncommon. So when that happens, home range size likely shrinks significantly. But as a general rule, females are going to spend, the year over about, 4, 5, 6,000 acres would be pretty normal in the mountains. And then when you start thinking about males, it's going to be 2, 3, 4 times that would be normal. And interesting too, we end up moving some bears around with, for one reason or another, we may have a bear that's getting into somebody's cornfield, or, some kind of minor situation, and we see the need to relocate a bear. When we do that and we put collars on them, it really, they can move when they want to. We've had some examples this year that were just crazy to think of, in terms of how far these bears can move when they want to. Certainly when you translocate a bear like that, you sort of mess its, you kind of throw a monkey wrench in its plans, and they move around tremendously in those situations. So we've had males that, instead of 15,000 acre home ranges, they've had hundreds of thousands of acres of home range. So they're covering basically half of the North Georgia area.
Wow.
And, in those situations, it's largely due to those that we've disrupted a little bit with some moving them around and things. But, the normal situation is 4,000 or 5,000 acres for females, and maybe, tens of thousands for the males.
Okay. Wow. I had no idea it was that large. Have you ever seen any of those that you relocated, travel a long distance to get right back where they started from?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And that's pretty much what they do.
Okay.
There's maybe a few exceptions with young bears, and we're learning more about this. As long as I've worked with bears, I've heard that, and I've heard that from other bear managers, folks up in the Smoky Mountains that have been, collaring bears a lot longer than I have. That was always the kind of general knowledge people shared is, when you relocate bears, especially if there's a food source in place, they're just going to return, it's just a matter of how long it takes them to get back. So it does provide some temporary relief sometimes, but in terms of a long-term solution, it's generally not the greatest. But yeah, we've had some examples. Even this summer, we had a sow with cubs, so a sow and 3 cubs. She was maybe a little more defensive of her cubs than some bears are, so she was drawing attention from some of the residents in the area. She was moved about 60 miles over to a remote part of one of our WMAs, and like 3 weeks later, she was right back where she started.
Oh, man.
And the cubs were with her because we had pictures on camera of her with the 3 cubs. Now, interestingly enough, that same bear a week later had traveled right back to where she was released. So it's crazy to think of how that works and how they can navigate that well. And I mean, just physically how they can do it, crossing tons of roads where she's tending the cubs the whole time. And anyway, it's pretty amazing. But yeah, they can do it. We've had some pretty bad examples of that over time where, a bear gets into trouble and we move it, and 3 days later it's right back to where it started, So yeah, they can find their way home and frequently do.
So I'm guessing from the way it sounds, roads, rivers, that kind of stuff are not any real barrier then to bear travel.
Not generally. I mean, I always kind of temper that point with just saying, that a road is not a road is not a road. And so when, think about roads in the Chattahoochee National Forest, a little dirt road up in the mountains, that's nothing, right? Bears actually travel down those sometimes if there's not a ton of traffic on them. That may be their preferred travel route. You branch out a little further and you get onto the paved roads and the county roads. Well, they're probably not, going to use those as travel corridors, but it's nothing for them to cross those paved roads, whenever they need to or want to. You get over to something like, highways and I-75, things like that. We do have bears that are killed on I-75 every year. You get bears killed on, I-10, I think it is, down central Georgia. You get bears that are dying on the interstate for sure, but that's a bigger barrier for travel than these other small roads. And rivers, sort of the same deal. They can cross a river. I think there's been some work down in central Georgia that kind of brought out the fact that, when you start thinking about sows and the small cubs crossing rivers, that's a little bit more of a challenge. Obviously, the example I just gave where, we had a bear moving like 99 miles in 3 weeks with 3 cubs in tow. Yeah, she's crossing some rivers, and it didn't seem to keep her from it.
Let's talk a little bit about breeding behavior, because that's something I don't know much about when it comes to bears. When do they breed? How long is their gestation? Kind of can you fill us in on that cycle?
Yeah. So generally speaking, our bears are breeding, at least in the mountains, they're breeding, June, July. And that's probably true in all 3 populations. That's the time when most of our bears are in, basically rutting behavior and that sort of thing, if you want to call it that. But they're breeding, during the summertime. Those females that are bred at that time, it's a little different with bears. Those fertilized eggs don't actually implant into the uterus until the bears crawl in a den. So they just kind of float around, and then basically come denning season. So when a bear goes in the den in the fall, now those eggs that have been fertilized, they're basically implanting at that time, and then probably about 2 months later, you're going to have cubs born. So it's a very interesting, advanced, I would say, breeding cycle, and it's a little different than other critters, but yeah, just tremendous system that seems to work really well for them. Obviously, when bears give birth, in Georgia, most of our bears probably, a common litter size would be 2 or 3 cubs. It's not uncommon to have 4. It's not unheard of to have more than that. There have been a few examples I've heard of and seen pictures from 5 and 6 cubs, but those were, all in the mountains for the most part. And those were, very uncommon, I would say. You don't hear about those much, but 2 and 3 is by far the norm. And of course, our sows that are bred and have cubs this year, those cubs will den with them again next year in most cases. And then that following spring, when they come out of the den, basically they're going to have a few months with the sow, and she's going to provide them some protection for a little while, but then they're going to be out on their own shortly thereafter, and then she'll be back breeding again that summer. So they breed on about a 2-year cycle, and so it takes them about that long to raise cubs and send them off on their own. So a lot of times you'll have, the young male bears in the spring that have been kind of pushed out of their mother's range a little bit, and they're kind of off on their own for the first time. They're the ones that you hear about on the news and the ones that are getting into trouble, 100 pounds or less, and wandering around in these places and looking kind of rough because everywhere they go, they meet up with a more dominant male, and he sends them packing, and they're like, okay, trying to find something that doesn't hurt to go to. And so they end up out in places where there aren't very many bears, and those will sometimes get into trouble with, getting into garbage and things like that. But yeah, that's pretty normal cycle. Breed in the summertime, give birth in the den. They'll emerge from the den, in the spring, and they're out and about for the rest of the year, and then they'll go back and den with their mother again that second year before kind of breaking up with her there shortly after den emergence that second year.
Okay. So they'll be a little over a year old then when they kind of take off on their own. Is that?
That's right.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah.
And you said at that point they're roughly 100 pounds or so?
Yeah, it's going to be food dependent. So, when you have a lot of food, they can, we have a rule, with our hunting seasons, or basically we protect bears under 75 pounds. Most cubs of the year don't reach that threshold. So usually that gives them at least to their second year before they're technically eligible for harvest. That's the intent.
Okay.
But, if a bear has a particular, I guess if a bear is exposed to a lot of human provided foods, or maybe they just happen to be in an area with a ton of natural foods, it's possible. You see it more in urban and suburban settings where there's non-natural foods, but sometimes bears can reach that threshold in 1 year. But yeah, a second year bear on just under 100 pounds is pretty common.
Okay. Now you've mentioned a few times about bear research, being involved in bear research. And I know we've already touched on some of that, but what are some of the things you guys are specifically looking at with current research? Yeah.
Well, if you may have heard about the North Georgia bear dog hunts that were added in 2019. So we started, historically Georgia has allowed bear dog hunting in southeast Georgia, and it's a long-standing tradition there. It's worked well for the swamp and never had any issues at all. There was a push and a desire to see that expanded to the mountains. And so in 2019, there was basically the addition of a 9-day quota bear dog hunt on Chattahoochee and Chestatee WMAs. And those are two of our areas, I guess, WMAs that, have had historically some of the best bear hunting in North Georgia. Some of the highest harvest per square mile. And, in some years, Chattahoochee would be neck and neck, if you will, with Cohutta WMA for maybe the most bears. A lot of times Cohutta would win that battle just because Cohutta is 96,000 acres, and Chattahoochee and Chestatee combined for about 50,000. So anyway, we added that hunt, but in order to better understand any impacts that may happen, as well as interactions, we're trying to learn as much as we can about that opportunity. And bringing a bear dog hunt to North Georgia from a biological standpoint is really not a huge concern on a small scale, especially with 9 days and looking at it on these two areas. But, how that hunt might impact the harvest, around those areas is one thing. Of course, bears don't, they just like they don't know the state boundaries. They don't know WMA boundaries either. So, they don't live solely on that 50,000 acres. So how does, an increased harvest potentially on these two WMAs, how does that affect the harvest overall in that area, or even potentially in North Georgia? We wanted to understand a little bit more about bear movements. So we do have GPS collar bears that we're monitoring prior to the hunt, during the hunt, intensively during the hunt, and then even after the hunt. So just trying to understand, if these bears are, encountering dogs on a regular basis during that 9 days, does that change anything? Do they decide to up and move to an area that's not being hunted, with dogs? And in some cases, we've seen that. Other cases, those same bears that moved out, maybe after 2 or 3 or 4 days of pressure with dogs, 6 weeks later, they're right back in that same spot where they started. So, it's been educational, and we're trying to understand. We're putting collars on bears, but we're also we've got a grad student, Kat Carter, at UGA, and she's putting collars on dogs during the hunt as well. So we're monitoring both the dog and the bear interactions during the hunt, and just trying to understand more about that. We're also monitoring bears, in the wintertime activity. So we're looking at den sites and reproductive behavior and all that. And we're going to have a comparison site on Cohutta. So we're doing all the same type of research on Cohutta WMA as a control, if you will, or an area that theoretically doesn't offer bear dog hunting. There are some bear dog training opportunities near to Cohutta, so it's not a perfect system. And of course, when bears cross over into Tennessee, Tennessee has a lot more opportunity for bear dog hunting. So overall, though, it's been great. It's been educational. We've been able to monitor some of these movements that we were just talking about a little while ago, and trying to learn some practical lessons from it, as well as some more advanced information that the university's helping us with. So hope to learn a lot from it, and we already have so far. So it's been good.
Yeah. That's definitely interesting stuff there. Always love to, whether it's deer or bear or whatever, it's always interesting to me to see, those GPS collar research, just getting that peek inside of how these animals are behaving, and how, like you said, how they respond to hunting pressure and that kind of stuff. It's interesting stuff for sure.
Absolutely.
Now, how long have we been hunting bears here in Georgia?
I think you got to go back to like the earliest North Georgia hunting data that I'm aware of is like the late 70s. So 1979, we harvested like 21 bears in North Georgia. If you look to the future, 2020, we harvested 338. The highest year on record was 521, and that was like 2011 or 5,029, I guess. Listen at me. 5,000. 529 bears in 2011.
Gotcha.
So that's the highest harvest in North Georgia. We've seen some increases. I mentioned that earlier in South Georgia with the harvest. The highest year on record was last year in Southeast Georgia, and it was 222 bears.
Oh, wow.
When you look at the state, just overall, the highest year statewide would have been 2011, and that was 690 bears across the state that year.
That's interesting. It's so basically possibly a quarter of the population there in 2020, or at least the estimated population there, that South Georgia or Southeast Georgia population was harvested.
Right. And that's probably not completely accurate, because that 800, we've been using that number, and it's just a guide. It's not like it's really dictating much about, it's an estimate. So right. It's not being used so much to guide our management completely, but it's a conservative estimate. We've been using that 800 bears estimate down there for a while. Meanwhile, they've done some research over in Florida, and they've got estimates that were derived using this bear DNA marker recapture stuff. And I think you'll probably see us do some of that down there in the future. At least we hope to get a better handle on exactly what is going on. But 222 was a record by far. I mean, that was kind of shattered the previous record. The previous record was 161. So really last year was a big year in Southeast Georgia, and may have been a number of reasons for that. Everything from having pretty good weather. They only have 12 days of hunting in the counties down there, so they have 4 3-day weekends. But they also, the swamp was pretty full last year, and so there was a lot of water. And so I think that may have sent bears up on, maybe a little easier to get to than some years. So,
yeah.
But who knows? There's a lot going on there that we didn't know about or don't know about, but 222 is a record year by far.
Are you seeing an increase, I guess, in interest in hunting bears, or does that seem to be fairly steady as well?
I couldn't say that we could really prove it, but we don't have, if you think about the way we hunt bears in Georgia, you just need a big game license and a hunting license, right? So
right, yeah.
Big game covers deer, bear, turkey. We do some surveys to try to get at the number of bear hunters, but because of the fact that we have 3 bear populations across the state, and they're so different. Each of those populations, like we've been talking about, they're all different sizes. They've got different influences. They've got different harvest opportunities. We got one day of hunting in central Georgia compared to probably North Georgia, probably got the longest season anywhere in the country, So when you start looking at all those differences and then trying to survey people to say, hey, did you hunt bear? And, how many days did you hunt bear? And did you kill a bear and whatever? We do have the ability to quickly give you an estimate on the exact number of bears harvested, because at least on the legally harvested bears, because we require that 100% of our bears that are legally taken are tagged. So we know that number. But to get at the number of hunters, the people that are actually pursuing a bear, is a lot more challenging. And it's also challenging because, just like you're probably very well aware, you guys may have gotten into bear hunting recently, I don't know. But, have you been hunting bears your whole life? If you were in the woods and you saw a bear and it was legal, would you have taken it?
Right.
So you may have been deer hunting, just like I was talking about when I was a kid. I certainly went up to Chestatee and up to the National Forest, went deer hunting in the mountains. And if I had an opportunity to kill a bear, I would have. But was I deer hunting or bear hunting, So trying to understand the number of people that are actually pursuing a bear. We don't have a bear-specific license, and we don't really have a great way to tease that out to see, how many people are actually pursuing bears, and is that number changing over time. But generally speaking, I think, Georgia's a great destination for bear hunting. It's become a destination for bow hunters, even coming from out of state a lot of times. We got people coming from all over and going to the mountains of North Georgia to pursue bears. So I feel like it's grown. Certainly the bow hunting public in North Georgia and bow hunters in Georgia in general have really picked up over time. And it's a pretty interesting little phenomenon there, because we actually see some years, it's pretty common for our archery harvest to account for like a third to 40% of our total bear harvest. So bow hunters in Georgia are pretty successful. In some years, we actually have tipped the scales and actually harvested more than 50% of our total harvest with bow hunting. And you don't really see those kind of numbers in other states nearby. There could be other things going on that could help explain that, but I feel like our bow hunters have sort of figured out how to be more successful, and they really get out there in the early season and chase bears, and it's been very productive for them.
Yeah. You think that's a big part of that's just the timing, maybe, the timing with the acorn drop, or maybe why the archery hunters are so successful?
I think so. I mean, the years when they really make an impact on the total harvest. So, again, a normal year would be a third to 40%, I would say, of the total harvest is due to archery. Some years that may be as low as 20%, and some years it's been upwards of 50%. Those years when it tops 50%, those are almost always years when there's a shortage of acorns. So those years we were talking about earlier, when there's not as many acorns out there and the bears are concentrated, hunters are communicating and hunters are scouting and finding sign, and they're going out there and putting in the work, and then they're harvesting bears. And sometimes you'll hear reports of, I was hunting this ridge and I saw 10 bears, come through and things like that. And it's just, that's pretty neat. But I think our hunters have kind of figured that out. And so certainly in some years, they really have been successful. Now, when you look at other states, their seasons are timed a little differently. That could be part of it. They also have different methods. There's a lot of dog hunting in those other states, and maybe archery is not as big a component in some of those states. I don't know. But in North Georgia, at least, our bow hunters have been very successful. And just like we started this conversation talking about how starting about 2011, we've seen this sort of steady leveling off that's kind of taking place in the mountains of North Georgia. That's been with still hunting, and that's almost unheard of when you look at other states. But at least it was historically. It was almost unheard of to think that you could manage a population with just still hunting. Nobody, just still hunters. And here we are, we've been able to do that. We do have that 9-day hunt that we've added. And some of these other states, they've seen some trending down as well. It just took longer, I think, for everybody to kind of realize that's what's going on. But some of that was just naturally a function of the acorn crops and the high harvest, that were taking place too. So been an interesting journey. I can remember back 2009, the trend was up. Nobody saw it coming down. Never believed that it would even begin to go down. And so like things like our bear bait station survey that we do every other year in the mountains, historically that survey went from like 12% back in the 80s, 12% visitation by bears over 5 nights. And it jumped up to like 76, 77% in 2009. And at the time, everybody just, believed that survey was just going to be useless because the difference between 100% visitation and 77 is so little. It's like, that's not very sensitive, maybe we need to do away with the survey. And I was thinking, well, yeah, that could be, but what if it goes down? And, nobody really thought it would ever go down. But in fact, our visitation dropped down, for a few years there, basically. And we were doing it in every other year at that time. So basically it went from about 77%. It dropped down to, I forget now the exact number. I was looking to see if I could find that graph, but probably here it is. So it just sort of trended down. It wasn't like it had huge drops, but got down about 50% in 2015. It's back up a little bit now, but we're up in the 60s, it seems, these last few years that we've done it.
Okay. Well, looking a little bit, I guess, at hunting strategy. Now, you've already mentioned a few WMAs here. Can you find bears in pretty much any of the North Georgia WMAs, or are there specific ones that are, I guess, a better starting point than others?
I mean, there's certainly ones that tend to be better, historically for bears. But, if you go to an area where there are plenty of bears, I mean, a lot of these national forest WMAs in the mountains, there are bears there. Some of them, I'm thinking about areas like Blue Ridge or Cooper's Creek or even Rich Mountain WMA. Those are areas where they may not make a list, of the top bear areas, but at the same time, they're always going to have bears. And so when you find food in those areas, and especially in a year, when food seems to be concentrating bears, those are good areas to go to. So yeah, there's definitely bears on most of our North Georgia WMAs. And while some may top the list, the others, generally speaking, aren't bad either.
Are there any public land opportunities for the central or the southeast Georgia populations, or is that all pretty much private land?
Central Georgia is all private land at the moment. You may recall back, several years back, it wasn't always the case when the seasons were restricted, I think, to Okie Woods, maybe even Oak Mulgee. I can't remember the specifics there, but there was a time when it was tied to the WMAs down there. As that population maybe grew a little bit, or as we decided to kind of open it up a little bit, it was opened up to the counties, but now the WMAs are acting more as a little bit of a protection area, if you will, for bears. So currently, the WMAs in Central Georgia are closed to bear hunting, but the counties around are open, and even this year, Bleckley County was added. When you go to southeast Georgia, most of that hunting takes place on private lands around the swamp. There is some hunting on Dixon Memorial WMA down there, and a few folks take advantage of that, but I think it's all still hunting on Dixon. So, yeah, generally speaking, it's mostly private in those two areas compared to in North Georgia. You got tons of opportunity on public and private land. And even outside the WMAs in the mountains, you got a lot of national forest areas that are not WMAs where there's a ton of bears. So it's not always been easy to tease out what was a private land bear kill versus what was a bear that was killed on the Chattahoochee National Forest. We may be able to do that a little better going forward. We've added game check this year as a requirement for folks in North Georgia when they're checking bears. But yeah, overall, I would say, about 35% of our harvest in 2020 took place on WMAs in North Georgia.
Okay. Well, what kind of things would a hunter, or would you tell a hunter to, I guess, concentrate their efforts on, a new bear hunter? Now, obviously, we've talked about it a lot. Food is going to be key, but I guess where should they focus their efforts in finding that food, I guess?
I think the best way to get at that, honestly, if you're starting out, and I talk to a lot of people that are starting out and kind of pursuing bears, and a lot of times it takes time. I mean, it takes years sometimes for them to really figure it out. But there are certainly, examples where people hit the woods and they find sign and they can take a bear. Early season is by far the best time to take a bear in North Georgia. When bears are still foraging in the trees, you'll have people reporting, seeing bears in trees, shooting bears from trees, or in the tree. It's almost like squirrel hunting in some situations. They talk about archery season, early season, when bears are foraging in the trees, and they'll walk up and you may have 2 or 3 bears in one tree in some situations. So early season's by far the best, focused on white oaks if you've got them. If it's a year like this year, and this year's, again, it's kind of different because I'm getting some indicators that we might not have as many acorns as in some years. But I'm also hearing from hunters and talking to folks, and it seems like, bears are somewhat concentrated this fall. So it seems like a great time for people who are wanting to take a bear, get out in the woods and do it now. Go spend some time walking, go to the mountains, go to historically good areas. If you're familiar with one, then choose that one. But if you're not, then pick one of these, that you hear so much talk about. I mean, Cohuta's a great place. Chattahoochee and Chestatee obviously are great places, but Swallow Creek's another good one. Rich Mountain's another good one. Dawson Forest. There's a lot of opportunity on public land for bear. So get out, do some scouting, look for sign. Right now is a great time for bears to be putting down a lot of sign, broken branches, scat, claw marks on trees. All these things kind of point you to areas that are hotter than others. And if you can find one of these areas where bears are concentrated, it'll be a fun and exciting hunt opportunity for you.
Yeah. So get out and burn some boot leather, basically, and find that fresh sign.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously bears, if you're going out for the first time, I mean, I would look at, thinking about the topography and trying to understand, travel corridors. A lot of times bears will walk ridge tops. But that's not all, they're going to go find food. And that's everything to a bear right now. So if you can find acorns, unless they're just everywhere. I mean, if you go into a place and bears are, acorns are everywhere, you may have trouble, finding a bear at that point because they may just be laid up in one spot somewhere. They're not having to move around as much in those situations. And so they're not putting down as much sign. But it certainly seems like this is going to be a pretty good year. We started off really strong. I think we had 73 bears game checked in North Georgia so far this season. So we're on track for what I would say is a really good harvest year at this point. Granted, it's only 2 weekends into the season, so that could change. But we're starting off strong, and as strong as we've ever started off, I would say, for North Georgia. So it seems like a great year to be in the woods looking for bears. And I would just encourage folks that want to pursue a bear and want to take a bear. There's no better time than now.
All right. Terrain wise, do they seem to have a preference? I mean, should you be looking high or looking low, or is it just strictly food based?
Yeah, I've gotten mixed reports. I mean, every year is different. There have been years in the past when we have late freezes. I think we had one of those maybe in 2007, if you remember back that far. Maybe late April that year in North Georgia, we had a freeze, and that was pretty unheard of. And that year, everything at lower elevations had already started to, leaf out and kind of start growing, and thought it was spring, and then all of a sudden it got zapped with this cold weather. So that year, we didn't have any acorns that fall down low, or at least no white oaks. And then when you went to the mountains, the higher elevations, they were still kind of dormant at that time, and so it didn't affect them at all. And then that fall, they had, plenty of acorns. So there's certainly times when we've seen elevational trends in acorn availability. This year, I've gotten some mixed reports, so I wouldn't feel great telling you one way or the other. I've heard both. I've heard people say that they're seeing bear and bear sign at lower elevations, and I've also heard the opposite of that this year. So a little too early for me to give you a definitive answer on the elevational component of this year, but I think we're going to have some acorns. I don't think there's a complete shortage this year, but at the same time, it does seem like maybe it's a function of just having a lot of bears. We've had 2 good acorn crops back to back, this being potentially the third of those seasons in a row that we've had good acorns. We're going to have a lot more bears that have been produced, a lot more bears have survived, and so maybe it's just that, but it seems to be starting off strong and pretty good time to be chasing bears.
Good deal. What about that? We talked about earlier that 70-pound threshold is the legal harvest, has to be over 75 pounds.
Right.
Is there any trick or tips to kind of making that judgment, I guess, if you're a new bear hunter?
Yeah, I always tell people, if I'm a new bear hunter and I'm trying not to harvest anything that's illegal, obviously, I'm going to focus on a few different things. So a 75-pound bear is really small, but if you're not used to seeing bears, the adrenaline gets pumping, and people describe 75-pound bears as 200 pounds all the time.
Yeah.
So, they think that it's, if you've not spent time around bears, it's easy to overestimate that weight. But when you look at bears, a lanky, long-legged looking, scraggly looking bear, most of the time, if you describe it as lanky or long-legged like that, the most it's probably going to weigh is 150. Now, when you look at them and they look like a little short-legged thing, and their body's not very long, and their ears look really large relative to the size of their face, that's a bear you probably need to pass on. If you watch the bear's behavior, the behavior will tell you a lot about the weight and the dominance. A small bear tiptoes around, and the acorn hits the ground, and they dart off one way or the other because they're scared that something's up, and they're just nervous. And it's pretty common for small bears. They'll be looking back over their shoulder, watching all around, and just worried to death, about the bigger bear or whatever else might be out there that hunters and everything else. So they tend to behave in a way that kind of tips you off a little bit that they're at least not a very dominant bear. But on the other hand, when you see a big bear, for one, if you see a really big bear, nobody has a question, right? You're just like, that's a bruiser. They're thick, they got a massive head, their legs just kind of melt into their body. You don't see the legs sticking out much. A really long frame bear, those almost never, you don't have to worry about weight in those cases. Generally, those generally, if you describe it as having a real long body, they're usually a bigger bear. And then they just walk around like they own the place because they kind of own the place. So, those things all together, I just say, if you have any questions, just pass. And if you're hunting food sources and all, you may have other opportunities anyway. So be a little more selective and just hold out for a bigger bear if you can.
Yep. Yeah, definitely better safe than sorry in that case. Always, if it's in question, let it go. Or if there's any question, let it go.
That's right.
Robert, you got anything else before we kind of wrap things up?
Nah, I've just been taking a lot of notes and enjoying kind of listening. So, Adam, thank you for your time and this morning coming on and talking everything bear with us in Georgia. And I know me and Brian have kind of thrown the idea of getting out and about and maybe trying to chase some bears. And I've actually been to Chestatee. I've been to Cooper's Creek and, that Chattahoochee National Forest and Blue Ridge area. And those are beautiful areas, man. But I can imagine some of those ridge tops, you look at them and it's like, man, I don't know if I want to get to the top of that thing. So you're up there,
Right. Yeah. Well, the work starts when you shoot a bear. That's I do tell people that all the time. And, finding them is challenging and all that. But yeah, when you pull the trigger, you release that string, that's when the real work begins. So I would keep that in mind based on, if you're going to have to pack a bear out of the mountains and try to get it out, either better have a lot of friends and a lot of compadres to come help you tote it out of the woods, or you better have a good plan in place. And so, anyway, well, good luck to you guys. Hope you guys have a good season. Hope all your listeners do as well.
Well, we appreciate it. And anything else that we haven't covered that you wanted to discuss, or anything that needs to be mentioned here about bear hunting in Georgia?
I don't think so. I think we've covered quite a bit. So I appreciate
absolutely.
you having me on, and good luck to all of you.
All right. Well, we appreciate it, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
All right. Take care, Brian.
All right.
Y'all take care.
Yeah.
Thank you. You too.
All right, guys. With that, we're going to wrap another one up here. As always, hunt safe, shoot straight, but most importantly, hey, just enjoy your time out there in God's great outdoors.